The galaxy had known peace for 3,000 cycles, and the ancient races believed this peace would last forever because they had made it so through patience and wisdom and the simple truth that beings who lived long enough eventually learned that war was a waste of time and resources and life itself. The conclave of eternal races governed from the heart of the galaxy, a council of species so old that they had watched stars being born and dying like flowers in a garden that stretched across the universe. The Volanthi were the first among them, crystalline beings whose bodies could endure for 10,000 years without showing any sign of age or weakness, and they prided themselves on their logic and their calculations and their perfect understanding of risk and reward. The Arathi existed as vast clouds of consciousness that drifted between worlds, beings so ancient that they remembered the early universe when galaxies were still young and chaotic. Long ago, decided that physical form was a limitation they no longer needed. The Ketvan were silicon giants who measured their lives not in years, but in geological ages, slow and patient and utterly convinced that anything worth doing was worth doing over the course of millennia, rather than rushing into foolish action. These three races, and dozens of others like them, had created something beautiful. A civilization that spanned millions of worlds, where knowledge flowed freely, and art flourished, and science pushed the boundaries of what was possible. But beauty built on patience has a flaw that the ancient ones had forgotten, and that flaw was simple. When danger comes fast, patience becomes a death sentence. The hollow appeared at the edge of the galaxy without warning, a tear in the fabric of reality itself that consumed everything it touched and left nothing behind but screaming emptiness where stars and planets and entire civilizations had once stood. Existed. Scientists from 100 worlds tried to study it and understand it and find some weakness they could exploit. But the hollow defied all their models and theories because it was not a thing that followed rules. It was absence given hunger. It was the void learning to eat. The fringe worlds fell first, young civilizations that had only recently discovered faster-than-light travel, and joined the great community of sentient beings, and their desperate calls for help echoed across every communication channel in the galaxy. We are the people of Karath, and the darkness is coming, and we beg you to send ships, send weapons, send anything, because our children are dying, and we cannot stop it. This is Emergency Beacon 7 from the Yulthari Collective, and we have lost contact with 3 colony worlds, and the hollow is moving toward our homeworld, and we need help. Please, someone answer us. To anyone who can hear this message, we are the last survivors of Mendrath Station, and we have seen what the hollow does to living things. And it is not death. It is worse than death. It is being unmade while you are still aware. Please help us. Please. The conclave received every message, recorded every scream, calculated every loss with perfect precision. And then they did what ancient beings do when faced with a problem that requires immediate action. They deliberated. Ambassador Kelveth of the Volanthi stood before the great council chamber and presented his analysis with the calm certainty of someone who had lived for 9,000 years and believed he understood how the universe worked. The hollow represents a significant threat to galactic civilization. This much is clear. But we must consider the mathematics of intervention carefully before committing resources to what may be a futile effort. He gestured, and holographic projections filled the chamber with data and charts and probability curves that painted a picture of cold rationality. If we engage the hollow directly, we risk drawing its attention to our core worlds, and our projections suggest a 23.7% chance of catastrophic losses to Volanthi territory alone, which is simply unacceptable when we consider alternative strategies. The Arathi representative, A shimmering cloud of light that spoke through vibrations in the air itself, offered its own perspective in tones that carried the weight of billions of years of existence. We have observed many threats throughout our long existence, and the pattern is always the same. Entropy claims all things eventually, but those who are patient can outlast any danger, and our calculations suggest the Hollow will exhaust its energy reserves within approximately 40,000 standard years. 40,000 years, a younger ambassador from a species called the Threnal said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. And how many will die in that time while we wait for mathematics to save us? Between 3 and 4 trillion sentient beings, according to our models, Kelveth replied without any change in his harmonic tone. A tragic loss, certainly, but acceptable when measured against the potential extinction of our own civilizations. The Kethvon delegation said nothing, because they had already entered hibernation mode, their massive forms still and silent as they waited for the crisis to resolve itself over the next several centuries. One by one, the ancient races chose survival over sacrifice, patience over action, mathematics over morality, and the conclave reached its decision through the consensus that had governed them for millennia. They would not fight. They would wait. They would let the young and the weak and the desperate burn, while they retreated to their fortress worlds and calculated acceptable losses with the cold precision of beings who had forgotten what it meant to be afraid. The beacon of last resort activated automatically when the Hollow crossed into the inner systems, an ancient emergency protocol designed by civilizations long dead who had understood that some threats required everyone to fight together or die alone. The beacon broadcast its signal on every frequency and in every language and across every dimension where sentient beings might exist, a simple message repeated endlessly. Existential threat detected. All spacefaring civilizations requested to respond. Coordinates follow. For 147 days, the galaxy listened to silence. The Volanthi monitored their borders and refined their calculations, and congratulated themselves on their wisdom. The Urathi began preparations to relocate their consciousness to another galaxy entirely, a journey that would take 10,000 years, but would guarantee their survival. The Kethvon slept and dreamed their slow silicon dreams, and trusted that the universe would sort itself out eventually. And the young species, the mortal species, the ones who measured their lives in decades rather than millennia, died by the billions while their cries for help went unanswered. But the beacon kept broadcasting, patient and persistent, and utterly indifferent to the despair of those who had given up hope, because that was what it was designed to do. And somewhere, on a small blue world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star in the unfashionable outer arm of the galaxy, someone was listening. Someone who had never learned that some fights were impossible to win. Someone who would answer the call. Admiral Yuki Tanaka had lived for 63 years, and in that time she had learned one truth that guided every decision she made. Life was too short to waste on fear. She stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, the flagship of humanity's first and only interstellar fleet, and watched as her communications officer decoded the alien signal that had been repeating for nearly 5 months. "Admiral," Lieutenant Commander Torres said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you need to see this." The translation software that Earth's best linguists had developed worked slowly but accurately, converting the alien transmission into words that humans could understand, and what those words described made Tanaka's blood run cold. There was a galaxy out there, vast beyond imagining, filled with thousands of intelligent species and civilizations that had existed for longer than humanity had walked upright. And something was killing them. The signal calls it the Hollow, Torres explained as data scrolled across his screen. Some kind of entity or phenomenon that consumes everything it touches, stars, planets, people, and according to these transmissions, nobody is fighting back. Nobody at all? The older species, the ones who have been around for thousands of years, they have decided that fighting is too risky, so they are just going to wait and let it burn itself out. How long will that take? Torres swallowed hard before answering. 40,000 years, Admiral, and the projected death toll is somewhere between 3 and 4 trillion sentient beings. Tanaka stood perfectly still for a long moment, her mind processing numbers that should have been impossible to comprehend. Trillions of lives written off as acceptable losses by beings who had the power to help, but chose not to. She thought about her grandfather, who had survived the horrors of war and rebuilt his life from nothing because giving up was not an option. Never an option, he considered. She thought about her mother, who had led her community through the collapse, when governments failed and ordinary people had to save each other because nobody else would. She thought about every human who had ever lived and died, and fought for something bigger than themselves, not because victory was guaranteed, but because the fight itself mattered. How far away is this hollow? She asked. 40,000 light-years, more or less. And our fastest ships can travel at what speed now? We achieved stable faster-than-light capability 18 months ago, Admiral, and our best estimates suggest we could reach the affected region in approximately 3 months if we push the engines to their limits. The bridge crew had stopped working, every officer listening to this conversation with a mixture of fear and something else, something that looked almost like hope. Tanaka turned to face them, these brave men and women, who had volunteered to sail into the unknown aboard ships that were held together by determination and engineering miracles, and humanity's stubborn refusal to accept limitations. I am going to ask you a question, she said, and I want honest answers, not the answers you think I want to hear. She paused, making eye contact with each of them in turn. We have 17 ships, 12,000 personnel, and technology that these ancient civilizations probably consider primitive. And out there is a threat that has destroyed entire star systems, while the most powerful beings in the galaxy stand by and do nothing. Her voice grew stronger with each word. Every rational calculation says we should stay home and protect Earth and hope the hollow never reaches us. Every logical analysis says we have no chance of making a difference. Every mathematical model says we would be throwing our lives away for nothing. She smiled then, a fierce expression that her crew had learned to recognize as the face she wore when she was about to do something impossible. But when has humanity ever let mathematics tell us what we can and cannot do? The response came not in words, but in the straightening of spines and the lifting of chins, and the light that appeared in eyes that had been uncertain just moments before. There are people dying out there, Tanaka continued. Not statistics, not numbers in a projection, but people with families and dreams and fears just like us, and they sent a message asking for help, and nobody answered. She placed her hand on the console in front of her, feeling the vibration of the ship that would carry them across the stars. We are going to answer that call. The communications officer opened a channel to the rest of the fleet, those 16 other ships, crewed by humans who had chosen to leave everything they knew behind for the chance to explore the universe. All ships, this is Admiral Tanaka. We have received a distress signal from the galactic community. A threat called the Hollow is destroying civilizations and killing billions, and the species who have the power to stop it have decided that saving lives is not worth the risk. She let that sink in for a moment before continuing. We spent thousands of years fighting each other over territory and resources and ideas. We nearly destroyed our own planet more than once, and we have made mistakes that we are still trying to fix. But we also learned something in all that struggle. We learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important. We learned that the measure of a species is not how long they live, but how they choose to spend the time they have. The ancient races out there have forgotten that lesson. They have lived so long that they have forgotten what it means to fight for something that matters. Her voice dropped to something, almost gentle. We are going to remind them. Set course for the Hollow, all ships, maximum speed, and may whatever gods humanity has ever believed in watch over us, because we are about to do something that nobody in this galaxy thinks is possible. We are going to answer the call. The fleet moved as one, 17 ships carrying 12,000 humans who knew they might never see Earth again, who knew the odds were against them, who knew that by every rational measure they were sailing toward their own deaths. But rationality had never been humanity's defining trait. What defined them was something older and fiercer and more powerful than logic, something that had carried them from caves to cities to the stars themselves. They called it hope, and they were bringing it to a galaxy that had forgotten what hope meant. The human fleet arrived at the edge of conclave space after 3 months of travel that pushed their engines to the breaking point and beyond. And what they found waiting for them was not the welcome of grateful allies, but the cold curiosity of beings who looked at them the way scientists look at interesting insects. Ambassador Kelveth of the Valanthi had been chosen to meet these strange new creatures from the Outer Rim, partly because his diplomatic skills were legendary, and partly because nobody else wanted to waste their time on a species that would be dead from old age before the next council session. He stood in the meeting chamber, aboard his diplomatic vessel, his crystalline body catching the light and scattering it into rainbows that would have taken a human's breath away. And he studied the small delegation that had come to speak with him. Captain Marcus Cole was 41 years old, a career military officer who had never imagined he would be representing his entire species in first contact with alien civilizations. But fate had a way of choosing unlikely heroes. You have come a great distance, Kelveth said, his voice a harmony of tones that the human translators struggled to convert into something comprehensible. And we are curious about your intentions. Our intentions are simple, Cole replied. We received your distress beacon, and we came to help. The Valanthi ambassador made a sound that might have been laughter, if crystalline beings could laugh. A chiming cascade of notes that seemed to express amusement and pity and condescension all at once. You do not understand what you have found here, little mortals, and I suspect you do not understand what you are facing. He gestured, and holographic displays filled the room with images of the Hollow, that terrible absence that ate light and matter and hope itself, and the humans watched with expressions that shifted from horror to determination. Hollow has consumed 18 star systems since it appeared, Kelveth explained in the patient tone of someone addressing children. It cannot be reasoned with because it has no mind. It cannot be destroyed by conventional weapons because it exists partially outside our dimension. And it moves faster than any fleet can respond to because it does not obey the normal laws of physics. So what is the Conclave doing about it? Cole asked. We are doing what wisdom demands. We are waiting. Our projections suggest the Hollow will exhaust its energy reserves in approximately 40,000 standard years, at which point it will collapse and cease to be a threat. Cole stared at the ambassador for a long moment, his human face displaying emotions that Kelveth found difficult to interpret. 40,000 years, the captain said slowly, and how many will die while you wait? Between 3 and 4 trillion sentient beings, according to our most accurate models, Kelveth replied, the evenness of the ambassador's tone unbroken. Tragic loss, certainly, but acceptable when weighed against the risks of direct intervention. Acceptable. The word hung in the air between them, and Kelveth noticed something strange happening to the human's expression. Something that looked like confusion, but deeper, more fundamental, as if Cole was struggling to comprehend something that should have been obvious. Ambassador, Cole said, his voice quiet in a way that made Kelveth's crystalline structure vibrate with an unfamiliar sensation. I need you to explain something to me, because I truly do not understand. Of course, I am happy to clarify any points of confusion. You just told me that trillions of people are going to die. Trillions. and you called it acceptable. How is that possible? How can any thinking being look at suffering on that scale and decide it is not worth trying to prevent? Kelveth felt something he had not experienced in centuries, a moment of genuine uncertainty. The human was not arguing with his mathematics or questioning his projections. He was rejecting the entire framework within which those calculations made sense. "You do not understand because you are too young a species," the ambassador said, falling back on an explanation he had used many times before. "When you have existed for millennia, as we have, you will learn that the universe is vast, and time is long, and individual lives, while precious, must be measured against larger concerns." "When we have existed for millennia," Cole repeated, and now there was something in his voice that sounded almost like pity. "Ambassador, I am going to die in maybe 40 years. 50 if I am lucky. Everyone on my ship will be dead in a century, and humanity as a species will probably never live as long as you have already lived." He stepped forward, and Kelveth was surprised to find himself stepping back. "We came here knowing we probably will not survive this fight. 40,000 light years in ships that your people would probably consider primitive toys. And we did it, because there are people dying right now, today, at this very moment, and they asked for help. But the mathematics clearly indicate that intervention carries unacceptable risks and offers minimal probability of success. I do not care about your mathematics." The words were not shouted, they were spoken with absolute conviction, the kind of certainty that comes from something deeper than logic. "I care about the child on some world I have never heard of, who is crying for her parents while the darkness closes in. I care about the old man who spent his whole life building something beautiful, only to watch it be unmade before his eyes. I care about all the people who sent those desperate messages begging for someone, anyone, to answer." Cole's eyes met Kelveth's crystalline sensors, and the ambassador saw something there that he had not seen in thousands of years. The previous message used, wasn't? It means we do not have time to wait for better options. It means every second matters. It means we cannot sit back and calculate acceptable losses, because every loss is unacceptable when you know your own life is just as brief and fragile. "But you will die," Kelveth said, and for the first time his harmonic voice carried something that sounded like genuine emotion. "You will throw your lives away against a threat you cannot possibly defeat." "Maybe," Cole agreed, "but at least we will die trying. At least we will die knowing we answered the call. And maybe that is something your mathematics cannot measure, but it is everything to us." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "We are going to fight the Hollow, Ambassador, and we are probably going to lose. But we are going to show this galaxy what it looks like when someone chooses to stand up instead of standing." "You could stay," Kelveth heard himself say. "You could join the conclave and wait in safety, and your species could survive." Cole smiled, and there was no anger in it, only a strange kind of peace. "Survival is not the same as living, Ambassador, and a species that would let trillions die to protect itself has already lost something more important than existence." The humans left, and Kelveth stood alone in the meeting chamber for a very long time. He had lived for 9,000 years, and in all that time he had never once questioned the wisdom of the conclave. He was questioning it now. And somewhere deep in his crystalline heart, a feeling he had forgotten stirred to life. The Hollow came to Kethvar Prime on a morning that would have been beautiful if anyone had been awake to see it. Twin suns rising over mountains that had stood for 1 billion years. Oceans reflecting light that had traveled across the universe to illuminate a world where silicon giants slept and dreamed of eternity. The Kethvan had already accepted their fate, entering the long sleep that their kind used to wait out disasters that would pass in mere millennia, trusting that the mathematics would protect them as it had always done. They did not expect to wake, they certainly did not expect to wake to the sound of human weapons fire. Admiral Tanaka stood on the bridge of the Defiance as her fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly in front of the Hollow, and for one moment she allowed herself to truly see what they were facing. It was not darkness exactly, it was the absence of everything, a wound in reality where light and matter and meaning itself ceased to exist. And looking at it made something deep in her human brain scream that this was wrong, that this should not be, that existence itself was being violated. "All ships reporting ready, Admiral," her tactical officer announced, his voice steady despite the fear that everyone on the bridge could feel. "Broadcast on all frequencies," Tanaka ordered. "I want everyone in this system to hear this." The communications officer opened every channel they had, sending their message to the sleeping Kethvon and the watching conclave, and anyone else who might be listening. "This is Admiral Yuki Tanaka of the United Earth Fleet. We are engaging the Hollow. Repeat, we are engaging the enemy. To all ships and all species in range of this transmission, if you can fight, then fight with us. If you cannot fight, then run and we will buy you time. But we are not leaving." The Hollow had never encountered anything like this. In its existence, it had consumed species that commanded technologies humanity could not imagine. Species that had existed for millions of years. Species that considered themselves gods. None of them had fought. Fighting was irrational. The mathematics clearly indicated that resistance was futile. Every calculation showed that confronting the Hollow directly resulted in certain destruction. But humans had never been very good at mathematics when lives were on the line. "All ships, weapons free, target the center of the anomaly and fire everything we have." 17 ships opened fire at once. Particle beams and missiles and experimental plasma weapons that Earth's best scientists had designed in desperate haste. All of it converging on a point in the center of the Hollow, where sensors suggested something that might be a core. The Defiance led the charge, pushing through interference that made instruments scream and hull plates groan, and Tanaka watched as her weapons struck the enemy. Impossible. The Hollow shuddered. It was not much, barely a ripple in that terrible absence, but it was something that had never happened before in all the time the Hollow had existed. It could be hurt. Tanaka had approximately 3 seconds to feel triumph before the Hollow struck back. The Defiance came apart like paper in a hurricane, not destroyed in any conventional sense, but unmade, its matter and energy simply ceasing to exist as the Hollow reached out and touched it. But in those final moments, as her ship died around her, Admiral Yuki Tanaka did something that would change the fate of the galaxy. She transmitted everything, every sensor reading, every analysis, every piece of data about where they had hit and how the Hollow had responded. All of it broadcast on every frequency to every ship in range. Her last words were not a cry of fear or a prayer for salvation. "We heard it," she said, and her voice was filled with fierce joy. Finish the job. Then she was gone. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen received the transmission aboard the frigate Unconquered, and she watched as the Defiance vanished from her sensors. As 1,200 people, including the woman who had inspired them all to cross the galaxy on a mission everyone said was impossible, were simply erased. She was 19 years old. She had a daughter back on Earth, a little girl named Maya, who would grow up without ever knowing her mother. And she had a choice to make. "All hands, this is Commander Chen," she announced, her voice carrying across a ship that had just watched their flagship die. "The Admiral's final transmission confirms what we came here to prove. The Hollow can be hurt, which means it can be stopped." She looked at the data, at the place where the Defiance had struck, at the tiny wound they had opened in the enemy's impossible body. "It is not enough to hurt it once," she continued. "To hurt it again and again, we need to make that wound bigger, and we need to do it now before it has time to heal." She took a breath. I am ordering the Unconquered to ramming speed. We are going to hit that weak point with everything this ship has, and I am asking for volunteers to stay at their posts. Every single crew member stayed. Today we show them what it means to be mortal, Chen said, and her voice grew stronger with each word. It means every second matters. It means we do not have the luxury of waiting for better options. It means we fight with everything we have, because that is all we will ever have. Ramming speed. Engage. The Unconquered died as the Defiance had died, unmade by a force that should have been unstoppable. But it died fighting, and its death made the wound a little bigger. One by one, the human ships threw themselves into the breach. The Canterbury and its crew of engineers, who had built engines that should have been impossible. The New Hope, carrying colonists, who had volunteered to become soldiers. The Resurrection, named for humanity's stubborn refusal to stay down, no matter how many times they were knocked to the ground. Each ship hurt the Hollow a little more. Each sacrifice widened the crack in its impossible armor. And across the galaxy, the ancient races watched in stunned disbelief as these brief, fragile creatures did what no one had dared to do. They fought back. The last human ship was the Endeavor, crewed by 300 volunteers who knew from the first moment that they would not survive this mission. Captain James Okonkwo stood at his helm and looked at the Hollow, smaller now than it had been, wounded in ways it had never been wounded before. "We will not defeat it today," he said to his crew, "but we have shown them that it can be defeated, and that is enough." He opened a channel to the Conclave, to the watching Valanthi and Orathi, and all the ancient species who had decided that fighting was not worth the risk. "This is Captain James Okonkwo of the United Earth Fleet. We are the last human ship in this system, and in a few minutes we will be dead." He smiled, and there was no regret in it. "Watch closely, because this is what mortality looks like. This is what it means to believe that some things are worth dying for. And if there is anything left of courage in your ancient hearts, now is the time to find it." The Endeavor hit the Hollow at maximum speed, and James Okonkwo's last thought was of his children back on Earth. The wound in the Hollow gaped wide, too wide to close, and somewhere in the depths of conclave space, Kelveth of the Valanthi watched a species die for strangers, and felt something break inside him. Something that needed to break. The galaxy changed on the day the last human ship died at Kethvar Prime. Not because the Hollow was defeated, but because something far more powerful had been awakened in the hearts of beings who had forgotten what it meant to care. Kelveth of the Valanthi stood before the conclave one day after the battle, and for the first time in 9,000 years, his crystalline voice trembled with something other than calculated certainty. "I watched them die," he said to the assembled ambassadors and leaders, who had spent centuries convincing themselves that their way was the only wise way. 12,000 beings who lived such brief lives that we would barely notice their existence, and they threw those lives away for people they had never met. The chamber was silent, which was unusual, because the conclave always had opinions and calculations and risk assessments to share. "They knew they could not win," Kelveth continued. "Their admiral said as much before she led the charge, but they fought anyway, because there were people dying and someone had to stand up." He let his words hang in the air. "We have existed for millennia. We have accumulated wisdom and power and technology beyond anything those humans could imagine. And when the Hollow came, we did nothing, because we calculated that doing nothing was the safest option." His crystalline form began to glow with an inner light that none of his people had seen in thousands of years. The light of emotion, of passion, of something that defied cold logic. "We were cowards," he said, and the word echoed through the chamber like a slap. "We dressed our cowardice in mathematics and probability, and called it wisdom. But those humans showed us what wisdom really looks like. It looks like sacrifice. It looks like courage. It looks like answering the call, even when you know you will not survive. He turned to face the full assembly, beings who had lived so long. They had forgotten why life was worth living. The humans are gone, but the wound they opened in the hollow remains. They proved it can be hurt, they proved it can be stopped. And now we have a choice to make. We can continue to wait and calculate, and watch trillions more die while we protect ourselves. Or we can honor their sacrifice by finishing what they started. The Urathi representative, that ancient cloud of consciousness that had existed since before the stars were young, spoke for the first time in the debate. They were so brief, it said, its voice carrying wonder and something that might have been grief. Their entire civilization exists for less time than we spend deciding what to have for breakfast. And yet they achieved something we never could. What did they achieve? Someone asked. They reminded us why existence matters. The vote that followed was not unanimous, but it was decisive. For the first time in 8,000 years, the Volanthi mobilized their war fleet. For the first time in recorded history, the Urathi turned their vast consciousness toward destruction rather than contemplation. The Ketvan woke from their long sleep and joined the fight with a fury that surprised even themselves. The war against the Hollow lasted 14 years. 14 years of battle and sacrifice, and a galaxy learning what humans had always known, that life is precious because it ends. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else matters more. That the measure of a civilization is not how long it survives, but what it is willing to die for. The Hollow fell at last, collapsed into itself by weapons and strategies, and a unity that would never have existed if 17 human ships had not led the way. And when it was over, the new Galactic Council gathered at Ketvar Prime to build a monument. They carved the names of every human who had died in that first battle into stone that would last for millions of years. 12,000 names of people who had lived such brief lives and made such an enormous difference. Beneath the names, they inscribed a single phrase in every language the galaxy knew. They answered. Kelveth stood before that monument 100 years after the war ended, and beside him stood a human child, a girl of perhaps 10 years old, with dark hair and fierce eyes that reminded him of someone he had watched die on this very spot. You are the granddaughter of Commander Chen, he said. I recognize something of her in you. My grandmother died before I was born, the girl replied, but my mother told me stories about her. She said grandmother was scared, but she fought anyway. She was very brave. She was very human. Kelveth had lived for more than 9,000 years, and he had witnessed things that would drive lesser beings mad. The birth of stars, and the death of galaxies, and the slow dance of cosmic forces that shaped the universe itself. But standing here, talking to this small mortal child, he felt something he had not felt in millennia. He felt humbled. May I ask you a question? He said. Of course. Your people knew you would die. You had no real hope of victory. So why did you come? Why did your ancestors cross the galaxy to fight for strangers they had never met? The girl looked up at him with eyes that held no trace of the condescension or amusement that Kelveth had once shown to her people. Because you needed help, she said simply, and we were there. Kelveth had spent thousands of years studying philosophy and ethics and the nature of existence itself, and in all that time he had never understood the truth as clearly as he understood it in that moment. The ancient races had believed that wisdom came from time, from patience, from the long view that only immortals could possess. They had been wrong. Wisdom came from understanding that time was precious, that every moment mattered, that the universe did not owe anyone 10,000 years. It only owed them now. And what they did with now was the only thing that truly mattered. 1,000 years after the Battle of Kethvar Prime, humanity had spread across the galaxy, still mortal, still brief, still burning with that fierce light that had changed everything. They lived longer now, a century and a half if they were lucky, but they never lost the urgency that had driven them from the beginning. They still rushed into danger when others held back. They still refused to calculate acceptable losses. They still answered every call for help with the same question their ancestors had asked: how can we help? The galaxy had many names for the ancient races: the Eternal Ones, the first civilizations, the wise elders who had seen the birth of stars. But humanity had earned a different name, a title given to them by the very beings who had once looked down on them as barely more than animals. They were called the Ones Who Answer. And whenever darkness rose, whenever some new threat emerged from the void, the galaxy knew exactly who would arrive first, ships blazing, ready to fight and die for people they had never met. Because that is what humanity had always done. That is what they would always do. And in the end, the mortals had taught the immortals the most important lesson of all: how to live.